Jon Snow stood atop the wall, the chill air biting at his cheeks, the wind ruffling his dark hair. Below him, the remnants of the battle at Castle Black still smoldered. Bodies had been piled together for burning, and the sense of smoke and death lingered in the cold. The clamor of steel had faded, replaced by the moaning of the wounded and the occasional crackle of fires still burning on the common grounds. He stared out into the vast emptiness beyond the wall, remembering her. He remembered the curve of her bow and the fire in her eyes. He remembered the last time he had held her, that moment of fragile hope before everything fell apart. He never thought to see her alive again. She had been struck by an arrow, and when he had rushed to her side, she looked at him as if uncertain whether to curse him for betraying her or cling to him for warmth. She had died in his arms, or so he had believed. Yet rumors had filtered through the ranks in the aftermath, whispering of a wildling woman with red hair, wounded but breathing, found among the injured outside the gates. He refused to believe these rumors at first, thinking they were cruel illusions conjured by his grief. But as he descended from the top of the wall, the unyielding chill pricking the skin of his face, he found himself seeking any sign that those whispers might be true. He stepped through the courtyard, which was littered with the aftermath of the night's chaos. Broken blades, battered shields, pools of congealing blood. Members of the Night's Watch struggled to move the dead, calling out names to identify the fallen if they could. The living fared little better, many of them wounded, including some too stubborn to rest. Jon could feel the weight of command settling on his shoulders, though the official title of Lord Commander was not yet his. Men looked to him for leadership, waiting for him to speak. But all he could think of was whether somewhere among these battered forms lay the one face he had thought lost forever. PYP spotted him first and raised a hand to wave him over. Near him was Sam, who had hardly slept. Sam's round face was pale, as though all the blood had run out of him. They stood by a small cluster of wounded wildlings under guard. Most were too injured to even attempt flight, though that did not stop the guards from watching them warily. Their clothes were ragged skins and fur, stained with blood and soot. Jon paused, heart thudding in his chest. The sight of wildling prisoners made him uneasy. He had come to understand them, even love them, in a way the Night's Watch never could. PYP stepped aside to reveal a figure wrapped in a tattered cloak. Her fiery hair fanned out across the dirt. Ygritte lay unconscious, an arrow wound in her shoulder bound with rough linen stained with dried blood. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. For an instant, Jon thought he was seeing a ghost. Her cheeks had lost their usual color, and flecks of dried blood dotted her lips. Yet there was no mistaking the shape of that face, the fullness of those lips that had once teased him with talk of how ignorant he was. He sank to his knees beside her, forgetting that he was surrounded by his brothers, forgetting that she was a captive. He reached out, feeling the warmth of her skin. Her eyes did not flutter open at his touch. "Ygritte," he murmured, voice low and urgent. He wanted to shake her awake, but he knew enough about wounds to guess her state was precarious. Sam coughed softly. "She lost a lot of blood," he explained. "The arrow must have hit her in the shoulder and missed the lung, or she wouldn't be alive. She hasn't spoken since we found her." Jon barely heard him. He was recalling her last words on that fateful night, how she had said they should have stayed in that cave, how she had looked at him like he was the only thing in the world that mattered. And yet duty had called him away, just as love had drawn him back. He brushed a strand of hair from her brow. Ygritte's skin felt cool against his fingertips. For the first time in a long while, his heart lurched with something other than grief. She was alive, and that changed everything. His brothers shifted uneasily. Many of them had fought off the wildlings mere hours ago, and the tension was thick. Jon knew he would have to answer for how he treated her now. As her faint breath continued, he looked up at the small group of the Night's Watch gathered around. A handful wore frowns, but some gave him the smallest nod of understanding. PYP, Gren, and Sam, especially. They knew Jon's story, how he had infiltrated the wildlings to gain information but had formed attachments there. They might not approve, but they comprehended the complexity. Jon stood and spoke, We need to get her inside, somewhere safe. When one of the older black brothers, Bowen Marsh, bristled at the notion, Jon fixed him with an even stare. She's badly wounded. Whether she's a prisoner or not, she deserves a chance to recover. She's no threat to us in this state. Bowen Marsh hesitated, but PYP interjected with an eager nod. Sam shifted, wringing his hands. In the end, nobody openly defied Jon's quiet command. He scooped Ygritte into his arms carefully, her head lolling against his chest. She let out a faint groan of pain, her eyelids twitching. The sound speared Jon's heart. He carried her across the courtyard and up the cold stone steps to one of the makeshift infirmaries. All around him, men of the Night's Watch stopped to stare. Some recognized the flame-haired wildling who had killed their brothers. Others whispered about how Jon Snow carried her as tenderly as if she were a wounded comrade. He sensed their judgment, but he did not falter. Inside the dim corridor, a single lantern flickered. He found a straw pallet near the hearth. Carefully, he laid Ygritte down and motioned for Sam to bring bandages and fresh water. Ygritte moaned softly, her eyes still closed. Jon touched her hand. "You'll be all right," he whispered, though he was not entirely sure if that was true. He had never seen her so vulnerable. In his mind, she was always so strong, fearless on the battlefield, confident in her beliefs, fierce in her affections. Now she looked almost small. The hours after that were a blur. The Watch's healers had their hands full with the wounded, and few were eager to help a wildling. Jon found himself tending her as best he could. Sam and PYP stepped in with uncertain hands when he needed more supplies. They undressed her upper body carefully, cleaning the blood from her wound. Her skin was slick with cold sweat, and at one point she lurched awake in a daze, screaming something incoherent about crows and betrayal. Jon calmed her, stroking her hair and telling her, over and over, that she was safe now. She drifted in and out of feverish dreams for 3 days. During that time, the Night's Watch scrambled to recover from the largest attack in living memory. Men from the surrounding villages brought supplies for the wounded. Outside Castle Black, confusion reigned among the wildlings who had lost their leader, Tormund Giantsbane having been captured and Mance Rayder rumored to be in dire straits since Stannis Baratheon's unexpected arrival. Despite the precarious ceasefire, tensions ran high. Word spread that the king beyond the wall might surrender or might burn. Nobody was quite sure. Jon spent sleepless nights at Ygritte's side, listening to her ragged breathing, cursing himself for not having saved her from that arrow in time. If she died now, it would be like losing her all over again. He could sense the wariness from his brothers, the unasked question in their eyes. What would Jon do if she survived? Could he truly serve the Night's Watch while harboring feelings for a woman from beyond the wall? But he had no time to dwell. Duty pressed in on him. Stannis wanted to parley with the wildlings. The Night's Watch needed the cooperation of the free folk to hold the true threat at bay, the White Walkers. Food was scarce, men were fewer, and winter was closing in. Jon found himself shuttling between war councils and the side of Ygritte's sickbed, never fully at ease. When a new day dawned on the third morning, he returned from a tense meeting only to find Ygritte awake, propped up on an elbow, wincing at the pain in her shoulder. She regarded him warily, as though unsure if she was dreaming or not. Her coppery hair was matted around her face, and her eyes were glassy with fever, yet the stubborn set of her jaw was unmistakable. Jon hovered at the threshold, fighting an onrush of emotion. This was the woman who had once shared his bed in a hidden cave, who had teased him about knowing nothing, who had risked everything to be with him. He stepped inside, keeping his voice low. "You're awake." Her gaze flicked across the chamber, taking in the low-burning hearth, the sparse arrangement of cots, the scurrying men in black cloaks at the far end. Then she fixed her eyes on Jon. She rasped. Her voice sounded like stone scraping against stone, raw with pain and exhaustion. "Am I your prisoner?" Jon hesitated. "You're being cared for. You were injured in the battle. We found you among the wounded." Her nostrils flared. "Why didn't you just let me die?" The question struck him like a physical blow. He could still see the fury, the hurt in her eyes, the sense of betrayal she had carried when she learned he was a spy for the Night's Watch. He drew closer, kneeling at her side. "I couldn't," he whispered. "I never wanted you to die, Ygritte." She studied him in silence. The flicker of the lantern revealed deep shadows under her eyes. She was thinner than before, her cheeks hollow from fever. At length, she let out a weak breath that might have been a sigh. "I suppose I should thank you." "You don't need to thank me." He reached for a water flask near the cot and offered it to her. "Here, you should drink. The fever's still in you, but Sam says it's broken somewhat." She eyed him suspiciously but accepted the flask. She raised it to her lips, took a long swallow, then grimaced at the taste. "You crows and your water. Give me a skin of ale and be done with it." A ghost of a smile touched Jon's lips. That spark of defiance was still there, undimmed. "I'll see what I can find." Time stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Ygritte tore her gaze away, focusing on the rough bandage around her shoulder. She attempted to move and winced. "I can't fight like this," she said, frustration lacing her voice. Jon placed a gentle hand on her good arm. "You shouldn't be fighting right now. Besides, the fighting's done for the moment. Stannis Baratheon came with his army. The wildlings have mostly surrendered or scattered." Her eyes narrowed. "Mance Rayder. He lives, for now. He was taken captive by Stannis." The corners of her mouth turned downward, sorrow mingling with bitterness. "Then it's all truly over." Jon fell silent. He thought of how Mance had once invited him to join the Free Folk, to stand with them as they tried to cross the wall to find safety from the White Walkers. He remembered how Ygritte had embodied that spirit of freedom and defiance. Now they were on the losing side of a battle that had claimed so many lives. In the hallway, footsteps approached. Samwell Tarly shuffled in, carrying fresh bandages and a steaming bowl of broth. When he saw Ygritte sitting up, he offered an awkward bow of his head. "Ah, you're awake," he said. I have some broth for you, and Jon wanted me to change your dressing, if you'll let me." She glared at Sam initially, but a moment later her gaze softened. She was far too weak to protest much, and she recognized that these were the people keeping her alive. "Fine," she mumbled. "But be gentle about it." Sam nodded vigorously, trying to hide his nervousness. Ygritte glanced back at Jon. "Don't go far, Crow," she muttered, her old nickname for him tinged with less venom now. He stayed as Sam peeled away the soiled bandages, revealing the mottled skin around the half-healed wound. Ygritte sucked in a sharp breath as Sam dabbed it with a cloth soaked in some mild antiseptic that Maester Aemon had left behind. Jon held her hand through the worst of it. He remembered how she never flinched at the cold or at the threat of death, but a healing wound was different. Pain had a way of humbling even the bravest of warriors. He murmured reassurances that she pretended not to need, and yet he felt her grip tighten around his fingers when Sam's cloth touched raw flesh. Afterward, she was trembling, her skin clammy. Sam quickly secured fresh bandages around her shoulder, tying them off as gently as he could. She sank back against the pillow, her breath ragged. Sweat beaded on her forehead. Jon offered her the bowl of broth, but she could only take a few sips before turning her head away. Exhaustion dragged her back into a restless sleep. Jon lingered after Sam left, watching over her. He suspected that it would be a long recovery. Once, he had imagined that if ever they were to be reunited, it would be out beyond the wall, sitting beside a fire, or in some hidden cave where they could laugh at the world's folly and forget the boundaries that lay between them. Now, the weight of reality pressed down heavily. They were in Castle Black. He was sworn to the Night's Watch, soon to be Lord Commander if enough of his brothers had their say. And she was a wildling who had fought them tooth and nail. The next few days passed in relative quiet. Stannis's men established their camp, and the Free Folk were corralled outside the gates, uncertain of their fate. Celis Baratheon and Melisandre watched on with hawk-like eyes. The Red Priestess's presence unsettled many of the men in black, but Jon tried to ignore the rumors swirling about her. He had enough worries. The nights were getting colder, and winter was practically upon them. The stores of food at Castle Black were not enough to feed hundreds of wildlings. Some arrangement needed to be made. Jon could feel the tension mounting with every passing hour. Yet in that uneasy lull, Ygritte's strength returned in increments. She would wake for longer periods, able to feed herself. She complained about the thin broth, about the chill in the room, about having to rely on the help of crows. But she never told Jon to leave her side. Something in her had softened, or perhaps she was simply too exhausted to keep up the walls of anger. Occasionally, Jon would catch her staring at him with a conflicted look, as if she was torn between hatred for the betrayal she had felt and gratitude for the care he was showing her now. One evening, when a pale sunset bled through the high windows, Ygritte beckoned Jon closer. He pulled a stool to her bedside. She studied him in silence for a time, then said, "I'm no captive, am I?" Jon exhaled slowly. "I can't let you just walk out of Castle Black. There are men who would want your head for what happened. But you're no prisoner either, not exactly. You once asked me to come with you," she said, voice low, as though recalling memories that hurt. "Back when we were in that cave. You said there was a chance." She trailed off, her brow furrowing. Jon swallowed. "I remember. You left me," she accused, but her tone lacked the biting rancor of before. It was a plain statement, tinged with old pain. "I had to," Jon said softly. "The night's watch was my duty. I never wanted to hurt you." She nodded faintly, accepting his words even if she did not fully forgive them. "You truly believe in that vow of yours?" He inclined his head. "I do." But then he dared to add, "I also believe the free folk have a right to live, that we're better off standing together against the things in the far north." Ygritte's eyes flickered. "The White Walkers. Mance always said they were the real enemy. Tormund, too. We marched south to escape them. But you crows saw it as an invasion." Jon remained silent for a moment. "We've never known how to see each other's point of view. Not until it was almost too late." He rubbed a hand across his face. "We're still not sure how to handle the situation. Stannis wants the wildlings to kneel. You and I both know they won't want to do that, no matter what fear or hunger might drive them." Her lips tightened. "I won't kneel to some Southron king." Jon studied her face. "I know. That's why I need your help. I need to speak to Tormund Giantsbane, to the Free Folk's leaders. If they refuse to kneel, maybe there's another arrangement that can be made. I want the wildlings to cross the wall peacefully, but that means we need to convince the North not to see them as enemies." She spat a bitter laugh, then clutched her shoulder as the movement jarred her wound. "You're talking about forging peace between free folk and kneelers. That's a fool's dream, Jon Snow." He gazed at her earnestly. "Is it? I think we can do it. If you help me, we can find a way. People used to say it was a fool's dream for a crow to love a wildling woman. But I did. I still do." She flinched as if struck, and for a moment the hardness in her eyes wavered. She looked away. "And if I say no?" He sighed. "Then I'll do it alone. But I don't want to do it alone." The small infirmary fell silent, save for the crackling of the hearth. Ygritte's expression flickered through a range of emotions: anger, grief, longing. She stared at her hands for a time, and Jon could almost feel the war within her. Finally, she let out a long breath, as though surrendering to something she could no longer deny. "Fine, I'll help you talk to the free folk," she said. "If only to keep them from starving or getting themselves killed. But don't expect me to kiss any king's ring." Relief washed over Jon. He gently laid his hand over hers. She did not pull away. "Thank you," he said, quiet but full of meaning. In the days that followed, Ygritte's convalescence became an unlikely symbol for a fragile alliance. Members of the Night's Watch grew accustomed to seeing her about, although never without watchful eyes following her. She refused to stay cooped up in the infirmary and insisted on limping around the courtyard, her movements stiff from the bandaged shoulder. She would stop occasionally to glare at a black brother who gave her a sideways glance, but the tension did not erupt into violence. Some of Jon's closest friends, PYP, Gren, and especially Sam. Attempted awkward conversation with her, trying to see if they could build rapport. Ygritte was curt, but she did not lash out. There was a subtle courtesy in the way she withheld her usual barbs. Eventually, Jon arranged for her to have a private meeting with Tormund Giantsbane. Tormund had been taken as a prisoner, along with some of his men, but they were being treated more as hostages than criminals, thanks to Stannis's demands for peaceful surrender. The meeting took place in a small storeroom near the main hall. The walls were lined with casks of pickled fish and salted pork, the smell thick in the air. 2 guards stood outside, but Jon insisted that the conversation remain between him, Ygritte, and Tormund. Tormund's broad frame seemed diminished by his captivity, but the fire in his blue eyes remained unquenched. He sat on a sturdy barrel, his wrists unshackled for this meeting, by Jon's special request. When Ygritte stepped inside, Tormund's face broke into a grin beneath his thick beard. "You're alive, you bloody spear wife," he roared, then let out a hearty laugh that echoed in the cramped space. She managed a small smile. "I've been better, Tormund. Heard you got yourself locked up." He shrugged. "Aye, these kneelers got me, but I'm not complaining too much. I'm not roasting on a spit, so that's something." He glanced at Jon. "This you're doing, Crow?" Jon bowed his head slightly. "I asked Stannis to keep you alive. We need leaders among the free folk if there's to be any peace." Tormund let out a bark of laughter. "Peace, is it? Ha! Never thought I'd live to hear those words from a crow." He turned a curious eye on Ygritte. "So you're working with him now?" Ygritte folded her arms across her chest, wincing only slightly at the pull on her shoulder. "We're trying to avoid more bloodshed, Tormund. The free folk have lost so many. We can't keep fighting. Not with winter coming and the walkers out there." Tormund's laughter died down to a thoughtful rumble in his throat. "Aye, that's the truth. Mance would have wanted to find a way south, for the safety of all. But kneeling? We're not kneelers, Ygritte, and neither am I." Jon cleared his throat. "I don't think it has to be kneeling. There might be another way. Stannis wants your loyalty, but maybe we can negotiate terms that allow your people to cross the wall, to settle in lands not claimed or scarcely inhabited. The North has vast stretches of untamed territory. You'd be under the protection of the crown, but you wouldn't be vassals in the same sense. At least, that's the arrangement I want to propose." Tormund snorted. "Sounds like we'd still be living under a king, just without the formalities." He stroked his beard, eyeing Jon. "Still, it might be better than freezing or being slaughtered." Ygritte spoke up. "You know me, Tormund. I'd not stand for anything that chains the free folk. But Jon's right, we don't have the numbers to fight another war, especially with what's coming." She paused, and her expression grew tight. "And if Mance is out of the picture, we need someone the free folk trust to talk sense to them." Tormund's chest puffed. "You think I can fill Mance's shoes?" Ygritte shrugged her good shoulder. "He always spoke well of you, said you had a big mouth and a bigger heart." Tormund let out a small grunt that could have been pride or reluctance. "All right, Spearwife. If it means keeping our folk safe from the Whites and the Walkers, I'll listen to these crows and their king. But I won't make any false promises. If Stannis tries to force us to kneel, we won't do it." Jon nodded. "I understand. I'll speak to him. I can't promise he'll agree to everything, but I'll do what I can. The Night's Watch cannot hold all of you at bay while also defending the wall from the White Walkers. We need you as allies, not enemies." The big man's grin returned, though it was tempered by the gravity of their situation. "Allies," he repeated. "Well, that'll be something to tell my grandchildren, if I live long enough to have any. Tormund Giantsbane, ally to the Night's Watch. The songs will be strange." They spoke for a while longer, discussing the immediate needs of the free folk: food, shelter, medical treatment for the injured. Tormund agreed to meet with some of the other captured leaders. He would attempt to sway them to a peaceful solution, on condition that Jon arrange a direct audience with Stannis. When they parted ways, Tormund gave Ygritte an affectionate cuff on the arm, mindful of her wound, and told her to get better so she could knock some sense into any other thick-skulled free folk. Ygritte managed a half-smile, though after Tormund left, she sank against the wall, exhaustion evident in her posture. Jon offered his arm, and she accepted it without protest. For a moment, they stood there in companionable silence, reflecting on how everything had changed. Over the following weeks, Jon found himself at the center of a precarious dance. He had to balance the needs and fears of his brothers in black with the demands of Stannis Baratheon, while also negotiating on behalf of the wildlings. Formal meetings were held in the hall, with Melisandre's unsettling red gaze often fixed upon him. The scars of the recent battle ran deep. Many in the Night's Watch could not forgive the free folk for the carnage, but Jon reminded them constantly that a larger threat loomed. Hardhome had fallen silent, and rumors abounded of restless dead. Ygritte, for her part, regained her strength inch by inch. She began sparring with some of the younger brothers of the Night's Watch in the courtyard, though always carefully. She could not yet pull a bowstring fully without pain, and the memory of how she had nearly died lingered in the stiff caution of her movements. Sometimes, the men she sparred with cursed her or tried to provoke her, perhaps still seeing her as the enemy. But none could deny her skill, and she earned a grudging respect from a few after she bested one of the recruits in single combat, even with her wounded shoulder. In small ways, the walls between free folk and black brothers began to crack. There were moments of shared laughter over meager meals, moments of mutual relief when stores of food arrived from the south. But these were overshadowed by the political storms building in the background. The Northern Lords had been summoned by Stannis to consider his claim to the Iron Throne, and they were not kindly disposed toward the wildlings. Jon knew that any permanent peace would require the North's cooperation, or at least their reluctant acceptance. Soon came the day that Jon feared, the day Stannis demanded that the wildlings swear fealty to him in a grand ceremony, or else remain outside the wall. It was a show of force, a gesture meant to demonstrate that the rightful king in the north was no friend to brigands and raiders. Tormund, of course, refused. Many others joined him. Ygritte snarled under her breath at the entire spectacle, her hand itching for the comfort of a bow. Jon stood at Stannis' side that day, his black cloak flapping in the wind, his face impassive. Melisandre hovered nearby like a silent red shadow. Tormund, flanked by a half-dozen free folk leaders, stood in front of Stannis' warhorse. The tension was palpable. The knights in Stannis' retinue glared at the wildlings. The men in black formed a watchful ring, uncertain of what might happen if the parley broke down. Ygritte was there, though not among the official representatives of the free folk. She loitered behind Tormund, her posture defiant. At one point, Stannis' gaze swept over her, recognition lighting up his cold blue eyes. Jon worried that the king might take offense at her presence or single her out as an enemy. Instead, Stannis ignored her. He reiterated his ultimatum in a grim, flat tone. The free folk could cross the wall if they bent the knee, pledging loyalty to the crown, or they could remain in the frozen wilderness beyond. Tormund puffed out his chest, refusing to kneel, but in the same breath insisted that his people wanted only to live. The two men glowered at each other, neither backing down. The parley ended in a stalemate, with Stannis giving them a fortnight to consider their position before the gates to the south would be closed. Afterward, in the privacy of one of the antechambers, Jon confronted Stannis. He argued that forcing the wildlings to kneel was a recipe for rebellion and that Stannis needed to find another path if he truly wanted them as allies. Stannis responded with characteristic bluntness that no king could allow such a large group of people to roam free in his realm without demanding loyalty. Jon retorted that these were not Southerners but free folk, and their identity revolved around the idea of never bending the knee. Melisandre watched the exchange from the sidelines, her expression unreadable. When Jon's voice rose in frustration, the Red Priestess quietly suggested that the king might consider a compromise, some form of vow that recognized his authority without requiring physical kneeling. Stannis gave her a sharp look but did not immediately dismiss the idea. In the corridor outside that chamber, Ygritte waited, pacing with restless energy. Her wound had mostly healed, leaving a scar on her shoulder that still twinged in cold weather. When Jon emerged, she pounced on him with questions. "How'd it go?" she asked, though her tone suggested she did not expect good news. He shook his head wearily. "Stannis won't budge. But Melisandre might have swayed him slightly. There's a chance we can craft some kind of vow that doesn't involve literal kneeling." She blew out an exasperated breath. "We're running out of time, Jon Snow. The free folk are hungry, and more winter storms are coming. We can't keep living in makeshift camps outside the wall." He ran a hand through his dark hair. "I know. Tormund and the others need to present a united front. If they come back with a clear proposal, maybe we can convince Stannis. In the meantime, the Northern Lords are on their way here. They'll have their own demands." She looked at him with burning eyes. "Let me help. Let me speak to the free folk. I'll remind them of what's at stake." Jon hesitated. Part of him wanted to keep her safe within the walls, away from the hostile gazes of the king's knights. But he knew she would never accept being sidelined. With a nod, he said, "All right, just be careful. There are still men who'd love to put an arrow in your back for what happened at Castle Black." A hint of a smile curved her lips. "They'll have to do better than they did last time." She touched her shoulder briefly, as if to remind herself of the narrow escape. "Besides, I'll stay near Tormund. He can draw fire away from me if need be." That night, Jon found Ygritte perched atop the wall, overlooking the sprawl of tents and makeshift shelters where the free folk were huddled against the cold. The wind whipped at their hair, and the moonlight cast a pale glow on the snows below. He stood beside her, leaning on the icy parapet. She glanced at him. "Remember the first time I came up here?" she asked, voice carrying softly over the wind. "You showed me the view, and I said I'd never seen anything so big and empty." Jon smiled faintly. "You were in awe. You said it was like looking at the edge of the world." She tilted her head, letting the wind ruffle her red locks. Well, it still is. But maybe the world's not so different on either side of this wall. We all freeze the same, bleed the same, love the same." She cast him a sidelong glance, an unspoken question flickering in her eyes. He reached for her hand, tentatively. "We do," he agreed quietly, giving her fingers a gentle squeeze. "And if we can just convince enough people of that, maybe we stand a chance." She leaned against him, just for a moment, letting her head rest on his shoulder. The ice beneath their feet groaned, and the cold bit at their skin, but there was warmth in that small gesture. After a moment, she pulled away, clearing her throat. "Enough of that. Daylight's coming soon, and Tormund will want to set off at first light to gather the rest of the free folk leaders." Jon nodded. "I should check on supplies for their journey." They parted, but the memory of her warmth against him stayed. In the days that followed, Ygritte joined Tormund's small delegation, moving between various pockets of free folk scattered around the region. Some had taken refuge in abandoned villages, others in cave systems. Her presence, combined with Tormund's reputation, went a long way toward unifying the free folk stance. They returned to Castle Black with a more cohesive proposal. Meanwhile, the Northern Lords began to arrive. Wary and proud, they brought their own retinues, and the courtyard soon brimmed with surcoats and sigils. The Karstarks, the Mormonts, the Glovers, and others. They came at Stannis' summons but found themselves glaring across the yard at the wildlings they had fought for generations. Jon found himself in the unenviable position of mediator, trying to soothe the fears of the Northmen while urging the wildlings not to provoke them. His nights were sleepless, filled with anxious strategy meetings. Ygritte sometimes watched him pace, half amused, half sympathetic. At last, a formal council was convened in the Great Hall, though it had been hastily repurposed. Stannis sat at the high table, Melisandre at his right, Davos Seaworth at his left. The Northern Lords took seats in the rows of benches, along with the Black Brothers who represented the Night's Watch. Across from them stood Tormund and a handful of wildling elders. Ygritte stayed near Tormund's side, arms crossed over her chest, chin jutted in challenge. Jon stood before them all, acting as a bridge between the two factions. Davos read out the basic terms of the proposed arrangement. The free folk would be granted the right to settle certain tracts of land in the gift, as well as other frontier regions in the north, provided they uphold the peace and refrain from raiding. The free folk would, in turn, agree to fight alongside the crown under Stannis, if the White Walkers indeed brought the war to the wall. At the mention of the White Walkers, the northern lords grumbled skeptically, though a few seemed uneasy. They had heard rumors from the Watch that the dead walked, but few truly believed. Tormund bristled at the notion of the free folk owing fealty to Stannis. But Davos softened the language, stating that they would come to each other's aid in times of dire need. Ygritte's expression remained guarded. She knew how easily words in a contract could twist. Then came the storm of protest from the northern lords. One stood, his voice echoing in the hall, accusing the free folk of murdering innocents for centuries. Another demanded to know how Stannis expected them to live in peace with those they considered savage invaders. Tormund roared back that the so-called innocents had also hunted wildlings for sport, calling them raiders and thieves whenever they ventured south of the wall. Accusations flew, voices rose, and the meeting threatened to descend into chaos. Jon stepped forward, raising his voice above the din. He spoke of the real threat, the White Walkers. He recounted what he had seen at Hardhome, the reanimated corpses, the unstoppable tide of death. He called upon the Night's Watch oath to guard the realms of men. He argued that the free folk were also men, women, and children who deserved protection from the terrors beyond the wall. He alluded to the horrific fate that awaited them if they could not unite. A silence stretched after he finished. The flicker of torchlight cast wavering shadows across the hall. Stannis studied Jon with an inscrutable expression, while Melisandre's red eyes glinted with something like approval. At length, one of the northern lords, Lady Lyanna Mormont, a girl of no more than 10, but fierce and proud, spoke up. She declared that the Night's Watch had protected her people in the past, and if Jon Snow said these White Walkers were real, she would heed his warning. She would never call a wildling lord, but if they were willing to fight for the North, she would not turn them away. The murmurs around the hall shifted in tone. Some respected Lady Mormont's bravery. Others sneered at taking advice from a child. But the conversation had been steered away from immediate hostility. Davos pressed on, guiding the factions toward a rough consensus. By the time the meeting ended, no one walked away fully satisfied, but no blood had been spilled either. A tenuous agreement had been hammered out. The free folk could cross, settle in certain lands, and in return they would support the Night's Watch and fight under Stannis if the realm was threatened. The northern lords grumbled but seemed resigned, especially given that Stannis needed the wildlings as an additional force to bolster his claim against any southern threats. In the weeks that followed, the trickle of free folk crossing the wall became a steady flow. Men in black helped them settle, providing basic shelter. There were arguments, brawls, and occasional clashes, but compared to the alternative, open war, the tension was bearable. Ygritte took an active role, moving among her people to reassure them that they had not simply traded one prison for another. Jon accompanied her whenever he could, and their combined presence, she as a respected free folk warrior and he as a representative of the Watch, eased more difficulties than either could have done alone. At night, they would return to Castle Black, sometimes exhausted, sometimes hopeful. They often shared a meal in Jon's small chamber, away from prying eyes. Their bond was still tested daily by suspicious looks and snide remarks, but a few black brothers had begun to accept Ygritte as more than an enemy. Sam, in particular, made an effort to learn about her life beyond the wall, scribbling notes in a journal. Despite her gruff persona, Ygritte found herself answering his questions. She sniped at him for writing down her every word, but Sam's genuine interest and gentle demeanor slowly chipped away at her reluctance. The darkest shadows, however, lay beyond the horizon. Whispers of whites and White Walkers came from rangers who ventured north. Jon heard terrifying reports of entire villages emptied, of the dead rising in droves. The free folk fleeing south also brought tales of half-seen shapes in the blizzards, pale figures on skeletal horses. Jon pressed this news upon Stannis and the northern lords, urging them to commit more resources to the defense of the wall. Some heeded him. Others were too focused on power struggles and refused to fully believe until the threat was at their doorstep. On a cold morning near the onset of the long night, a raven arrived with dire tidings. Eastwatch by the sea had seen strange lights on the water, and the garrison at the Shadow Tower reported vanishing patrols. This only heightened the urgency. Jon and Ygritte, along with Tormund and a contingent of loyal men from both the Night's Watch and the Free Folk, rode out to investigate a series of eerie sightings just north of the gorge. Their small party camped on a ridge beneath a sky thick with sullen clouds. Snow fell in a light but relentless drift. Ygritte stood beside Jon near the campfire, her gaze sweeping the dark treeline. She fingered the fletching of an arrow anxiously. She had begun practicing again with her bow, though her aim still occasionally faltered thanks to the lingering ache in her shoulder. "Do you remember," she said softly, "that time we hunted goats in the Frostfangs? You tried to stalk them as quiet as any free folk, and you tripped on a rock so loud I thought you'd scare off every creature for miles." Jon gave a tired smile. "You laughed at me for ages." She nodded, a small grin curving her lips. "Didn't know a crow could blush that hard." His smile faded as he glanced at the dark horizon. "I miss those days. It was simpler then." She snorted gently. "We were on the run from your crow brothers, and I had half a mind to kill you if you tried to betray us. Didn't feel simple to me." But then she sighed. "Though I suppose it was simpler than trying to broker peace between all these suspicious fools. At least I knew where I stood back then." He moved a bit closer to her, the heat of the fire warming his front, the cold nipping at his back. "Where do you stand now?" She met his eyes. "With you," she said, the words soft yet firm. "I might have called you a traitor once, but now I've seen what you're trying to do. I won't leave you to do it alone." He reached out and rested a hand on her uninjured shoulder, relishing the feel of her warmth through the thick furs. "Thank you," he murmured. She turned her gaze back toward the darkness. "Just don't die on me, you." When the dawn broke, their party scouted deeper into the forest and discovered unsettling signs. Footprints in the snow that seemed to materialize from nowhere, scattered bones picked clean as if by ravenous ghouls. A hush lay over the land, devoid of normal wildlife sounds. It felt as if the woods were holding its breath. Tormund muttered curses under his breath, glancing around for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a horn blast shattered the silence. One, then two, then three. 3 blasts. The men in black knew the meaning of that sound. White Walkers. A chill worse than any wind cut through them. Jon unsheathed Longclaw, the Valyrian steel shimmering faintly. He motioned for the others to form up. Ygritte knocked an arrow, her face set in grim determination. The free folk among them brandished dragonglass daggers or crude spears tipped with obsidian. They did not have to wait long. Figures emerged from the swirling snow, tall and gaunt, their skin pale as ice, their eyes glowing a cold blue. The White Walkers moved with eerie grace, accompanied by wights that shambled behind them. The party braced themselves, hearts pounding, as an unnatural wind whipped through the trees. Jon shouted for everyone to hold the line. Ygritte aimed at the nearest White Walker and let an arrow fly. The arrow, tipped with dragonglass, whistled through the air. The walker raised an arm to deflect it, but not before the black obsidian tip found purchase in its chest. With a shriek like ice cracking, the walker shattered. Ygritte's eyes widened with a mix of triumph and fear. The wights pressed forward, remnants of wildlings and Night's Watch rangers reanimated by the magic of the others. Swords clashed. Jon's party fought bravely but were outnumbered. Tormund bellowed a war cry, hacking apart a wight, only for its severed limbs to continue thrashing. A black brother went down, screaming as bony fingers raked his flesh. Jon found himself face to face with another White Walker. He swung Longclaw, and the Valyrian steel blade clashed against the walker's ice spear. A crackling jolt went up Jon's arm from the impact. A second blow, and the spear shattered, letting Jon drive Longclaw through the walker's chest. The creature screeched, disintegrating into shards of ice. But the battle was far from over. Ygritte fired arrow after arrow, each dragonglass tip effective against the White Walkers but less so against the swarm of wights that would not die unless fully dismembered or burned. The free folk, seeing that the battle was turning dire, began to fall back, calling out for a retreat. Jon realized they could not hold this position. Already, half their number was on the ground, and the remaining White Walkers advanced with terrible inevitability. "Fall back!" Jon roared, covering their retreat with furious sword swings. Tormund hefted a wounded black brother over his shoulder, while Ygritte aimed one more arrow at a pursuing walker. Her shot missed, thanks to the lingering weakness in her shoulder. She cursed, but Jon grabbed her arm. Together, they fled through the snow, stumbling over roots, slipping on ice. The Whites came shambling after them, too many to fight in the open. The horns sounded again, 3 blasts, this time from a vantage behind them. Reinforcements from Castle Black, or maybe from one of the northern lords. A mounted party charged in, brandishing fire-tipped arrows and torches. Jon glimpsed the banners of House Mormont flapping in the wind. Lady Lyanna herself had led a band of her warriors to investigate. Their torches and wildfire arrows held back the Whites just long enough for Jon's group to regroup. Arrows hissed through the air, and the stench of burning flesh, dead flesh, filled their nostrils. The White Walkers, outnumbered and wary of fire, faded back into the swirling snow, though their presence lingered like a nightmare. When the battle ended, the survivors were left panting and shaken. The ground was littered with chunks of ice and the remains of Whites. Blood stained the snow, and steam rose from the newly made corpses. Ygritte leaned heavily on her bow, gasping for breath. Jon, breathing hard, surveyed the carnage. They had lost nearly half of their scouts, and the White Walkers had only been driven back, not destroyed. Lyanna Mormont approached, face grim under her bare sigil helmet. "Lord Snow," she said, breath fogging in the cold. "So it's true, then. The dead truly walk." Jon nodded, eyes grave. "And this is just a taste of what's coming." That grim knowledge settled on them all. The march of the undead could not be stopped by words or treaties. This fleeting skirmish confirmed that, for all their efforts at forging peace between free folk and northerners, the real war was only beginning. Back at Castle Black, the news of the encounter spread like wildfire. The living had to unite, or they would all be devoured by the army of the dead. Stannis, upon hearing the account from Lady Mormont and Jon, grew more resolute in his commands. He insisted that the free folk formally declare their allegiance to him, framing it as a necessary alliance against the Walkers. The Northern Lords also saw that the threat was real, and though they despised the free folk, they began contributing supplies and weapons in greater numbers. Ygritte remarked bitterly that fear of the dead was a stronger motivator than any promise of peace. Yet she did not refuse the extra arrows and dragonglass. Every advantage would be needed. She fought side by side with Jon in future skirmishes, her fiery determination never waning. They grew closer in those grim days, finding brief moments of warmth in the cold corridors of Castle Black or in the hastily erected tents when they ventured out. It was under those desperate circumstances that Jon Snow and Ygritte became a team unlike any other in living memory. A crow and a spear wife, bridging the gap between once hostile peoples. They shared the common goal of survival, not just for themselves, but for everyone. As winter's harsh grip tightened, their negotiations with the North matured into something more solid. The free folk began to stake out small villages in the Gift, working the land as best they could. Night's Watch Rangers patrolled alongside wildling scouts, forging tentative bonds of camaraderie in the face of the undead menace. New arrivals trickled in from the south, knights and soldiers loyal to Stannis, uncertain about the prospect of standing shoulder to shoulder with wildlings, but forced to accept it. Lady Mormont, having witnessed the White Walkers firsthand, became one of the staunchest advocates for unity. Other northern lords, like the Glovers and the Serwins, followed suit, albeit grudgingly. Jon and Ygritte were called upon repeatedly to settle disputes, calm tensions, and remind both sides that the true enemy did not care about old hatreds. Late one evening, after a draining council where Tormund nearly brawled with a Karstark over an alleged insult, Jon found Ygritte standing outside Castle Black, gazing at the moonlit snowfields. The night was eerily quiet, the sky a tapestry of stars. He approached her, his black cloak billowing. She did not turn, but he sensed the tension in her posture. "Tormund's going to give me a heart attack," Jon murmured, attempting a small jest. Ygritte huffed a laugh. "He's Tormund. You don't quell fire like that easily." Then she faced Jon, her expression pensive. "You ever wonder if any of this will matter? Or if we're just staving off the inevitable?" Jon stepped closer, searching her eyes in the dim light. "Sometimes, but we have to try." She nodded, shoulders sagging a little. "When I was a child, I used to think the wall was this monstrous thing, this barrier keeping us from the good land. Then I climbed it, and I saw the world from atop its ice. I realized it was just a pile of ice, but it meant so many things to different people." She paused, swallowing hard. "Now I'm helping you tear down the invisible wall between our peoples, so we can stand together when the dead come." Jon's heart squeezed at her words. He gently cupped her cheek. "Without you, I couldn't have done any of this." She leaned into his touch. "I know." A faint smirk touched her lips before fading into seriousness. "But Jon Snow, promise me if we get through this, if we actually survive, you'll remember who I am." "I'll never forget." She took a breath, fighting an emotion that trembled behind her eyes. "Sometimes, I think I should hate you for dragging me into this madness, but I can't, because I know you're trying to save us all." Jon dipped his head, resting his forehead against hers. "We're saving each other." She let out a soft exhale, and for a heartbeat they simply stood there, two figures in the moonlight, bound by hope and fear and the tenuous threads of love. The wind stirred, and Ygritte finally pulled away, her gaze drifting to the horizon where, somewhere in the far distance, the White Walkers gathered their forces. As the long night loomed, the fragile alliance held, barely. Ygritte and Jon Snow led scouting missions beyond the wall, rallying stray bands of free folk who still roamed the tundra. On each mission, they encountered signs of the dead moving south, unstoppable and unrelenting. They pressed for more dragonglass, more Valyrian steel. The forges at Winterfell, last rumored to be manned by a blacksmith of some skill, were put to work forging new weapons from the meager supply of Valyrian steel that could be found. The rest had to settle for obsidian. Meanwhile, more wildlings were guided south to the Gift. The old hatred lingered, but as Ygritte often said, better a scowling neighbor than a white. Bit by bit, fields were tilled, goats herded, families huddled together in refurbished huts. The North watched warily but let them be, too focused on preparing for the winter storms that ravaged the countryside. Letters from the South trickled in, bearing news of conflicts around the Iron Throne. Rumors claimed the Lannisters were in disarray, that the Tyrells and other great houses had their own machinations. Most of that felt irrelevant in the face of the dead. Stannis still hoped to march south to secure his claim, but the mounting reports of undead activity stalled his ambitions. He found himself tethered to the wall, awaiting the blow that could come at any time. The nights grew longer, the cold more piercing. Soon, snow covered every inch of the north, and the sunsets came earlier, painting the sky in fleeting oranges and reds before yielding to endless dusk. Sometimes, Jon and Ygritte shared a moment before the hearth in the Lord Commander's chambers, for Jon had reluctantly accepted the role of Lord Commander by the will of his brothers. They would talk of the future, of a world where the free folk lived in peace with the North, where children could grow without fear of the Walkers. They allowed themselves brief, tender moments in that small space, though they knew they might be the last such moments they ever had. Amid all the uncertainty, one thing remained constant. Ygritte stood by Jon Snow's side. She attended councils with him, faced down lords who sneered at the wildling wench, and proved her worth in every skirmish. The respect she commanded among her own people and the grudging regard she earned from certain brothers of the Watch made her indispensable in forging the fragile peace. She was living proof that enemies could become allies, that love could transcend old hatreds, even if that love was sometimes tested by the burdens of leadership and the looming apocalypse. As word spread of the ongoing cooperation between the wildlings and the Night's Watch, refugees from beyond the wall continued to arrive, each new group weaving themselves into this precarious tapestry of survival. Families were reunited, or else learned their loved ones had perished. Tearful reunions and heartbreaking farewells mingled in the courtyards of Castle Black, forging a sense of shared humanity between black cloaks and fur-clad free folk. Soldiers from the north also came to bolster the defenses, and for the first time in living memory, free folk and northerners stood watch together upon the great ice ramparts, scanning the darkness for signs of undead horrors. Time's old resentments flared. A wildling youth tried to steal from a Night's Watch storeroom and was caught. A black brother spat on a free folk elder, remembering lost kin. More than once, violence erupted in dark corners. But Ygritte and Jon, along with Tormund, Davos, and even Lady Mormont, moved swiftly to douse these sparks using diplomacy or, if needed, a show of force. Neither side could afford disunity now. Weeks turned into months. The long night deepened, and with it came the gathering storm of the White Walkers. For all their efforts at forging alliances, the living knew a reckoning was coming. Whispers circulated of a great battle that would decide the fate of the realm, perhaps fought on the very fields outside Winterfell or the stony ground before the wall. Men spoke of the prince that was promised, of Azor Ahai reborn. Some looked to Jon, some to Stannis, others to more distant rumors. Ygritte cared little for prophecies. She placed her faith in the resolve of living hearts and the bite of dragonglass. One night, a raven arrived with a single parchment message. "They come." The scribbled signature indicated it was from the Shadow Tower. The White Walkers were on the move in force. Stannis roused his knights. The northern lords, having already massed their forces in the vicinity, prepared to march. The free folk gathered every warrior capable of wielding a spear or a bow. The Night's Watch manned the wall. The horns sounded in the cold night air, 3 blasts reverberating with a dread that seemed to grip the entire castle. Jon Snow and Ygritte stood in the courtyard, surrounded by organized chaos. Men rushing to mount horses, archers checking arrows, smiths handing out last-minute blades tipped with dragonglass. The air was electric with fear and purpose. Tormund bellowed orders in the free folk's guttural tongue, rallying them to stand together. Stannis's knights formed rigid columns near the gates. The once enormous gulf between wildling and northerner vanished in the face of a common enemy. Jon turned to Ygritte, his expression etched with a steeled calm. "This is it," he said, voice low. "One way or another, we stand or fall tonight." She met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "We'll stand," she said. "We didn't come all this way, make all this peace, just to die now." She checked her bowstring, testing the tension carefully. He nodded, swallowing hard. "Fight by my side?" "Always," she replied, and for a moment, a faint, determined smile touched her lips. Then they moved, joining the throng that filed out of the gates, into the darkness where the wind howled like a dying beast. Snow whirled in frenetic gusts, and the pale moon gleamed overhead. In the distance, a faint blue glow lit the horizon, the cold light of the undead ranks advancing. Steel met ice, men met whites, and the night erupted in the symphony of battle. For all the heartbreak and bloodshed that followed, Jon Snow and Ygritte remained together, forging ahead with the united forces of the living. Their shared resolve, their love, and their unwavering commitment to a fragile peace were the sparks of hope in an otherwise endless night. And though no one could know the final outcome, whether the living would triumph or the dead would blanket the realm in eternal winter, the legacy of Jon and Ygritte's bond would endure. They had proven that two peoples once bitterly divided could stand shoulder to shoulder against annihilation. In that union lay the seeds of a lasting peace. If dawn were ever to break again over the north, it would rise upon a land where free folk and kneelers alike had bled together, fought together, and survived together. And in that shared struggle, a new future might be born, one forged in the flames of love and tempered by the unyielding cold of duty, a realm forever changed by the audacious choice of a crow and a wildling to stand as one.